Olá, boa tarde, saudações, sejam bem-vindas, bem-vindos e bem-vindes ao primeiro encontro de pesquisa das artes medievais, o EPAM. Eu sou a Flávia Galitati, professora do Departamento de História da Arte, e eu faço parte da comissão organizadora do evento. O encontro de pesquisas das artes medievais, o EPAM, é organizado pelos participantes do Laboratório de Estudos Medievais, LEME, Unifesp, Núcleo História da Arte, da Escola de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da Universidade Federal de São Paulo. O EPAM é um evento acadêmico dedicado à divulgação científica e à criação de espaços de diálogo e reflexão sobre a história da arte medieval e áreas afins, com a finalidade de promover o contato entre pesquisas acadêmicas concluídas ou ainda em desenvolvimento nessa temática. Esse nosso primeiro encontro de pesquisas de artes medievais tem como tema o medievo artístico revisitado, espaços e transculturalidades sobre uma perspectiva multidisciplinar. A transculturalidade envolve o movimento de ideias, objetos e pessoas entre espaços. As trocas transregionais impactam diretamente na construção das experiências, dos saberes e das artes. Estudos recentes sobre as artes medievais têm privilegiado as distintas manifestações resultantes da mobilidade e dos encontros transculturais e transregionais, deslocando as tradicionais categorias da história da arte. Com as identidades nacionais, como as identidades nacionais, noções de estilo, etc. Este evento multidisciplinar procurará explorar as manifestações ocorridas no longo espaço temporal da Idade Média. Nossa conferência de abertura será feita pelo professor Dr. Michele Tomasi. Michele Tomasi é doutor pela Scuola Normale Superiore de Pisa e sua habilitação pela Sorbonne Université em Paris. Ele foi bolsista do Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art em Paris e do Getty Grant Program. É professor de História da Arte Medieval da Universidade de Lausanne, Suíça, onde leciona desde 2006. Ele se especializou em escultura italiana e francesa e artes suntuárias do século XIII ao início do século XV, com foco em materiais, métodos de produção, comitência e marketing. Ele também se interessa pela história da arte. Gosta de explorar territórios fronteiriços, onde a história da arte se encontra com a história religiosa, política, literária, econômica ou social. Autor de diversos livros, como Monument d'Avorio e Dossali de Limbriac, L'Art Multiplié, Production de Masse en série pour le marché dans les arts entre Moyen-Âge et Renaissance, e L'Arte del Trecento in Europa, entre outros. Michele fará uma conferência chamada Diplomacia e Desejo, a troca de presentes entre cortes entre o Oriente e o Ocidente por volta de 1400. Welcome, Michele Tomasi. It's a pleasure and an honor to receive you here.
Thank you very much for your introduction, too kind introduction. And thank you so much for your invitation to talk tonight. I am very honored to join you online, although I am frustrated that I cannot be personally with you in São Paulo.
Next time.
I hope so. And I need to apologize for I will have to make my talk in English, for I cannot speak Portuguese, so I'm sorry about that. During my talk, I will present you some preliminary results of an ongoing research project, and I'll be very happy if you have questions after my talk to answer them, and maybe Flavia Galitach can translate question and answers. So, as a contribution to the debates about transcultural exchanges in medieval art, my talk will address the problem of diplomatic gift-giving between the French courts and some Eastern princes around 1400. Building on a recent scholarship about gift-giving, medieval diplomacy, and East-West connections at the end of the Middle Ages, I would like to consider a few significant examples. Next slide, please. My contribution will principally focus on a few literary texts that can throw some light on the circulation of diplomatic gifts from France to the East during the reign of King Charles VI, who governed from 1380 to 1422. And you can see here Charles VI sitting in his in one of his Paris residences, the Hôtel Saint-Paul. These written sources allow us to understand what kind of luxury objects were appreciated and sought after by the elite groups of both cultural regions, East and West. They moreover show how the diplomacy of sumptuary gifts functioned. They also invite to ask if and how such gifts could have an impact on local artistic production. Most of all, such texts open a window on the perception of otherness. The texts I will examine with you were all written in the West. For this reason, they inform us best about the representation that their authors had of Oriental monarchs. In a way, I am less interested in their fidelity to reality than in their usefulness in teaching us how their authors and readers perceived themselves and the others. Next slide, please. I will first introduce you to a little-known booklet on Timur Long, or as he was known in the West, Tamerlane. Born in the 1330s, Timur was a Eurasian nomadic conqueror who built an empire stretching from Damascus to China and founded the Timurid dynasty, which ruled in Central Asia until 1507. After examining this little treatise, next slide, please. Oh, there is a missing one, sorry. Could you go back one? I'm sorry. After examining this little treatise, I shall delve into one of the most important chronicles of the later Middle Ages, the one written by Jean Froissart. I draw your attention to one episode concerning the diplomatic negotiations following the Battle of Nicopolis, when the Turkish army of Sultan Bayezid I defeated a Christian coalition of French and Hungarian knights. My concluding remarks will ask what kind of impact the gifts mentioned in these literary sources might have had on contemporary artistic production. So first, something about a visitor at Charles VI's court in 1403. In this year, a curious character was welcomed at the court of Charles VI. The official chronicler of the reign, Michele Pantoin, described him as, I quote, a certain Oriental bishop, member of the Order of the Preachers, end of quote. His name was John of Sultania, and he was actually a member of the Dominican order. Next slide, please. Of Italian origin, John of Sultania was born in a colony on the Black Sea coast. We know he was bishop of Nakhchivan in the last decades of the 14th century, and that he was promoted to the archiepiscopal seat of Sultania by Pope Boniface IX in 1398. And you can see both Nakhchivan and Sultania in the central part of the map. And on the far right of the map, the city of Samarkand, the capital of Tamerlane. Thank you for showing the sites. On 28th July 1402, Tamerlane crushed the Ottoman army of Sultan Bayezid near Ankara. It was after this battle that John of Sultania was sent as an ambassador from Timur to the French king. His aim was to promote an alliance both to improve the trade between East and West and to bettering conditions for Christian missions in the East. Next slide, please. While he was staying at the French court, the Archbishop wrote a brief biography of Timur called Les Ordonnances de Temir Bey. In May 1403, the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, bought from a well-known merchant, Jacques Rapond, 3 illuminated manuscripts containing texts illustrating the history of Christians in the East. The manuscripts you see on the screen was one of the 3, probably the one the Duke bought for himself. The 2 others were destined to his brother John of Berry and his nephew Louis of Orléans. The Codex contains one of the oldest copies of John of Sultania's biography. It is interesting to see how this little treatise circulated in the highest royal circles in a luxury edition. The booklet describes the most important aspects of the life and character of Timur: his origins, his children, his kingdom, his allies and enemies, his goodness and his great cruelty, his faith, his conquests, and the Battle of Ankara. This victory was of a particular interest in France, since Tamerlane won it over the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, who in 1396 had defeated the Christians in Nicopolis, taking prisoner the very son of the Duke Philip the Bold. The last chapter of the biography is of special interest to art historians, for John describes the tastes of the Mongol prince. The purpose of this short chapter is clearly to instruct the French court about the diplomatic gifts that might be sent to Tamerlane to gain his trust and goodwill. Next slide. So you can see the list of the things that Timur Beg loves more than any others, according to John of Sultania. At the end of the list, which is not on the screen, John mentions saffron, horses, hunting dogs, and Spanish mules. We know from other sources that these spice and animals were very widely renowned and appreciated in and outside Europe. All the other items listed on the screen are precious objects. Next slide, please. Textiles take pride of place in this list, and they are mentioned as the first possible gifts. This should not surprise us, since Northern European woolen and linen textiles were eagerly sought after throughout Europe and the Mediterranean basin. John of Sultania especially mentions linen clothes from Reims, which were a valued commodity at the time. Next slide, please. The inventories of the greatest lords around 1400 contain many of these fabrics, and you see that Charles V, the King of France, had fine fabrics from Reims. Valentine Visconti, the wife of Louis d'Orléans, also possessed a dozen of fine towels from Reims. You see that that fabrics from Reims were also in the inventories of John of Berry, and some other precious textile like scarlets appear also in the inventory of John of Berry. These mentions show that these are always extremely expensive textiles reserved for a small elite. It should be noted that both contemporary writers like John and the inventory refer to these tissues with the adjective délié, which you see on the screen. This means so fine as to become transparent. The appearance of this technical term in sources of a different nature proves both the circulation of a certain lexicon and the attention that nobles pay to fabrics. Next slide, please. Froissart also tells us that another prince from Western Europe, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, Lord of Milan, sent fabrics from Reims to the Sultan Bayezid to ensure his benevolence. As he says, I quote, "Every year, Gian Galeazzo Visconti sent him presents of hounds and hawks, or the finest linen or woolen cloth that could be procured at Reims, which is very agreeable to the Saracens, who have none but what comes from our country." Next slide, please. Besides textiles, according to John of Sultania, Tamerlane would also have delighted in tableware in cut hard stones mounted in silver and gold. Daniel Alcouf has shown that during the 14th and early 15th centuries, Paris was actually one of the most important European centers for stone polishing. In the next slide, you can see a newer in the Victoria and Albert Museum collections in London, made in France around the middle of the 14th century. It is a fine example of the kind of work Timur might have received with pleasure. Next slide, please. The Archbishop also mentions coral branches and strange fish teeth. I suggest that he is thinking of something like the credenza of the treasury of the Teutonic Order in Vienna, which you can see in the next slide. This kind of object was placed as a centerpiece on the table and was supposed to detect the presence of poison in the meals. The shark teeth were mostly assumed because the teeth you see on the branches are shark teeth. And these shark teeth were mostly assumed to be serpents' tongues. So the fish teeth John mentions might have been something different. Anyway, the object I show was probably made in the empire, but the inventories of French princes prove that they also own similar artifacts, and these were almost certainly made in France. And you see on the screen a description of a salt cellar with branches of coral and serpents' tongues that belonged to the Duke John of Berry. Next slide, please. At the end of his list, John of Sultania also affirms that Tamerlane loved tapestries. The importance tapestries take as luxury items around 1400 is well known, and here I only show you a celebrated example. and I'll tell something more about tapestries in a while. Next slide, please. So this short chapter by John of Sultania gives us a vivid image of the variety, of the richness, and of the complexity of luxury productions in Paris around 1400. To be true, the image he gives of Timur's tastes is a mediated one. Nonetheless, since the Archbishop had lived for a long time in Caucasus, and he presented himself as an ambassador of Tamerlane, he must have been familiar with the expectations and desires of the Mongol court. Moreover, as we have seen, all the artifacts he mentions were indeed among the most sophisticated productions of French workshops. His testimony sounds then quite reliable. We can trust him all the more since other contemporary sources confirm that foreign princes might desire the same sumptuous commodities. Next slide, please. Foremost among other sources of the time are the chronicles written by Jean Froissart during the second half of the 14th century. Froissart's historical work was one of the most successful bestsellers of its time. It gives us a lively and faithful picture of the ideals and of the values of late medieval aristocratic society. One episode he narrates is especially relevant to an inquiry into the circulation of diplomatic gifts between East and West. Next slide, please. The story is set after the terrible defeat inflicted by the Turks on the French and Hungarian army in the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. The winner was Sultan Bayezid I. On this occasion, many French princes were killed, others were taken prisoner, including Jean de Nevers, the son of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold. Jean de Nevers had headed the military campaign. The news of the disaster was brought to Paris by a knight from Picardy called Jacques de Hély, who had served the father of Sultan Bayezid. And the next slide shows the Sultan receiving a ransom. Actually, to facilitate the release of the prisoners, in addition to this ransom, it was decided to offer diplomatic gifts to the Turkish monarch. And Froissart tells us that Hély was asked to advise on what the Sultan might like. Let's see what gifts were sent to the Turkish sovereign, why and how they were received. This example is of particular interest since we have here a case of crossing cultural borders. We can see how a Hainault author describes and analyzes diplomatic and cultural exchanges between the French court and a monarch he perceives as an infidel. It is important to note immediately that the French accounts for this year are only partially preserved. The documents confirm that gifts were sent, but we do not get from them a clear, complete picture of the gifts. It is therefore impossible to know if Froissart's narrative corresponds to historical reality. So what matters to me is not what exactly happened in 1396. My goal is another one. First, I want to show how the story is plausible, especially in the eyes of Froissart's contemporaries, those princes and nobles who are also his protectors and readers. Then I want to explain how his account reveals the chronicler's perception of this word of the authoress, that is the court of the Turkish Sultan. So let's look at the first passage in the next slide. Jacques de Elie advises to send, as you see, tapestries from Arras or Picardy, as long as they represent good ancient histories. The Sultan would also be fond of white falcons, called gyrfalcons. Moreover, Jacques d'Olly thought that fine white linen from Reims and scarlet clothes would be very happily welcomed by the Sultan and his lords. There was plenty of cloths of golds and silks in Turkey, with which they were amply provided, and consequently they would like things they could not get at home. So the Sultan is first credited with the desire for two types of objects: useful animals for one of the most noble forms of hunting, and luxury products. Among these luxury products are Reims, fabrics, and scarlets, and we saw already that these textiles were indeed among the most popular of the time. According to Froissart, Elie would also have advised to offer tapestries. This is not only possible, but also perfectly plausible. In the next slide, you see a partial list of people who received gifts of tapestries from the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, during the years 1386 to 1400. Powerful men and women, lay and ecclesiastical, from England to Aragon, received tapestries from the Duke in order to strengthen relationships of alliance or friendship. Thomas Campbell witty wrote that, I quote, "A list of recipients of Philip's gifts reads like an international who's who of the rich and mighty of the day." End of quote. Next slide, please. I do not need to stress here that this kind of objects, and here you see an example of a tapestry from around 1400. So this kind of objects, which is materially valuable and technically difficult, was a relatively recent innovation. Historiated tapestries were then produced only in a small region of Northern Europe that was under the control of the Duke of Burgundy. He could therefore easily use this privileged position to distinguish people whose recognition he wanted to ensure. No Turkish source confirms Bayezid's interest in tapestries. Nevertheless, we know from the biography of Timur by John of Sultania that a prince from such a different culture might have appreciated this kind of artifacts. We also know that another non-Latin monarch in those same years was seduced by the Flemish draperies. Next slide, please. In 1399-1402, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos made a long journey to Rome, Milan, London, and Paris to obtain the help of the Western princes against the Turkish threat. During his stay in Paris, he was housed in the castle of the Louvre. He then wrote a long ekphrasis that you see on the screen of a tapestry representing the spring, which would have adorned his room. We won't read this text. I just want to point to the fact that the emperor thought it would be interesting to write a long bravura piece describing a tapestry. It can then be assumed that the Sultan, Bayezid I, could have also been attracted by such tapestries, just like Manuel Palaiologos, or Timo Lang. Next slide, please. If we still follow Froissart, this is the gifts that were finally sent. I quote, "These presents consist of pieces of the best work tapestry from Arras, representing the history of Alexander the Great and his conquests, which was a delightful sight for all men of honor. The finest linen, with an N, from Reims, and scarlet and crimson cloths, which were packed on 6 centaur horses." Next slide, please. Froissart also informs us that Bayezid claimed to have descended from Alexander the Great, and that he dreamed of conquering the world as the illustrious King of Macedonia did, and I quote, "Bayezid himself made them laugh, joke, and have fun, and said that soon they would pass with a great army into the kingdom of Hungary and conquer it, and then they would take over all the other Christian kingdoms and countries, and he would reduce them to obedience. And he wanted to rule like Alexander of Macedonia, who was the king of the world for 12 years, and of whom he said he was a descendant by blood." Next slide, please. No tapestry showing the story of Alexander the Great has survived from the years around 1400. We do know, nonetheless, that in later decades, many tapestries with the deeds of the Macedonian hero were weaved, especially for the Burgundian dukes. 2 beautiful tapestries were produced around 1460, possibly for Philip the Good, the grandchild of Philip the Bold, and are now in Genoa in northern Italy. You can see one of these hangings on the screen, and it can help us imagine the one that Froissart says was sent to Bayezid. Next slide, please. In fact, we know that the Duke of Burgundy himself owned several tapestries of Alexander the Great during his lifetime. As others have shown, from his reign, and even more so under his successors, the Macedonian hero became a model and a reference for the Burgundian dukes. If Philip the Bold, and you have seen some mentions of tapestries with the story of Alexander the Great owned by the Duke Philip the Bold, or offered by him to others. Excuse me. If Philip the Bold really sent a tapestry with the conqueror's campaigns, he could have made Bayezid believe that he was flattering him, because Bayezid believed to be a descendant of Alexander the Great, and he wanted to be a great emperor like Alexander. So, receiving the tapestry, Bayezid could have felt flattered by the Duke. But on the other side, the Duke himself could have seen in Alexander an image of his future revenge. So the message of the tapestries might have been twofold and have been understood differently in France and in the East. So it is plausible that a tapestry with Alexander the Great was actually sent to Bayezid. Beyond that, however, the episode seems important to me for deeper reasons. This case reveals the attitudes towards the arts that Froissart must have shared with his patrons and readers. Next slide, please. Taken together, the texts by John of Sultania and Jean Froissart clearly show that around 1300, diplomatic gifts often compressed luxury artifacts that were perceived as peculiar to a foreign culture and difficult to obtain. And it is this link between diplomacy, exoticism, and desire that I wish to explore in the last part of my talk. Next slide, please. If you take up again the first excerpt from the Chronicles, we see that according to Froissart, the Sultan and his family should have appreciated some objects because they could not easily have them. They would like things they could not get at home. Similarly, and we see that in the next slide, the Duke of Milan, the next slide. The Duke of Milan sent to the Sultan objects that the Saracens had none but what came from Western countries. The same attitude is attributed to the Ottoman court by an anonymous writer who around 1408 wrote the biography of Jean Le Maigre, who was Marshal of France and participated in the 1396 crusade. He was also taken prisoner after Nicopolis. In the next slide, you see the gifts that, according to this anonymous, were sent to Bayezid. His list only partially corresponds to the one made by Froissart, but like him, so he mentions falcons and vultures and also scarlets, fine clothes, linen from rams, and all those things that they don't have over there. So he also stresses that the Turks cherished items they couldn't get easily. So these texts taken together show that the exotic character of a luxury good is considered as a quality. A careful comparison of different texts and preserved objects from this period would prove that this taste for luxury products from afar and difficult to obtain was indeed a dominant feature in the princely courts around 1400. There is even a word that refers to these coveted goods. It is the adjective étrange, which should be translated, in my opinion, as exotic. I don't have time here to demonstrate these in detail. Nevertheless, a short extract from the biography of Charles V, written around 1404 by the well-known writer Christine de Pizan, shows in what sense this adjective was used, and we can read it in the next slide. Then the King Charles V would go to vespers. Then, if it was summer, sometimes he would go to his gardens. If he was indoors of his Hotel St. Paul, sometimes the Queen would join him, or his children would be brought to him. There he talked to women and asked about the condition of his children. Sometimes he was presented with exotic gifts. dons étranges from various countries, weapons or other war harnesses, and various other things. Or merchants would come to bring velvet, gold clothes, or other things, and all kinds of beautiful exotic things, again, belles choses étranges, or jewels. He then had them examined by the experts, connoisseurs of such things that belonged to his family. Here, objects described as étranges are clearly associated with ideas of exoticism, preciousness, pleasure, recreation, and intimacy. It is interesting to compare this passage with another from Froissart's Chronicles. Here, the writer describes the presentation of precious gifts to King Charles VI by the inhabitants of Paris. Froissart tells us how the delegation of bourgeois went to the king to bring him on a litter a large quantity of gold or gilded silver type tableware. Next slide, please. And what is interesting is that what Froissart writes at the end. He says, that when the bourgeois were gone, the king said to Sir William de Bourdes and to Montagu, who were with him, "Let us go nearer and examine what their gifts are." So, like Charles V and his the members of his family, Charles VI and two of his most intimate friends also like to look closely to precious objects. And from the perspective on intercultural relations, it is significant that Froissart attributes similar practices to Bayezid and his entourage. We can see this in the next slide. In the next slides, Froissart explains how the king of Cyprus sent a golden neph to the Sultan to soften him towards the Christians. A golden neph, you can see one in the next slide, is a table vessel in the shape of a ship that is used to mark the place of honor for the master of the house or important guests. Here you see one on the table of John and Barry in a famous miniature by the Limburg brothers. And in the following slide, you see an actual neph dating from the early 16th century and made in Paris. So Jacques, the king of Cyprus, had such a neph made for Bayezid I. And let's go back to the text in the next slide. You can see here that Froissart tells us that the neph was so beautifully and so well crafted that it was a pleasure to look at it, and was graciously accepted by the Sultan, who replied he would return him double its value in courtesy and affection. So here admiring of the neph is clearly associated to the realm of pleasure. It was a pleasure to look at it. And earlier in the talk, I showed other texts that contain similar formulations. Tapestries are said to be pleasant and agreeable to look at, or Froissart says that exotic things would give the Ottomans pleasure and entertainment. So In aristocratic circles, the most refined works of art are considered to provide a form of delight. And if we look at the next slide, sorry, the next one, and again the next one, yeah. Froissart tells us that the nef was accepted with great joy and much appreciated by the Sultan and by the members of his council. So, like Charles V or Charles VI, the Sultan also admires in a small group a precious object. Before concluding, I want to wonder how such artworks could impact local production. A manuscript completed in the Ottoman Palace in Istanbul at the end of the 15th century, which you can see in the next slide, can help me introduce this last point. It is a copy of the most important work of a poet who lived in the second half of the 12th century, Nizami. It was copied and painted in Herat around the middle of the 15th century. In the next slides, you see two full-page miniatures which were added when the manuscript was kept in the Ottoman Palace in Istanbul. And they are on the next slide. These miniatures, and I'm sorry for the bad quality of my images, are quite different from all the others, with a more naturalistic rendering of landscapes and vegetation and space, and with slender animated figures moving freely. Specialists of Islamic illumination explain such differences by assuming that the Western model was available to the later illuminator or illuminators. And in the next slide, you can see a comparison which have been suggested between one of these two added miniatures and a miniature by the Limburg brothers. One specialist formulated the hypothesis that the model might have been the Alexander tapestry that was sent to Bayezid after the Battle of Nicopolis. But there is a problem with this idea, because Froissart tells us that the tapestry never reached the Ottoman court. Next slide, please. He actually tells that he welcomed the ambassadors from France, bringing the presents to the Sultan. And he accepted that the ambassadors brought to the Sultan the falcons, because he says, and it's the end of the quote, to the gyr falcons I am indifferent whether he have them or not, for birds fly anywhere and are as soon lost as given. But with respect to fine tapestry, these are things to be shown, to be kept, that remain and are seen forever. Therefore, if you wish to make a journey into Turkey and present the Sultan with the falcons, you may do so, but you shall not carry him anything else. So according to Froissart, the tapestries were kept in Hungary. His account is here indeed somewhat doubtful, but it is interesting nonetheless, for it shows to what point tapestries were considered as durable and tangible signs of power and prestige. So we cannot be sure that these tapestries had any impact in Turkey, and I'm almost at the end. I would contend to finish that such exotic gifts as the ones Bayezid or Timur might have desired drove their value from their very otherness. They needed to be recognized as foreign, as imports that remained distinct from their new context, if they were to make their owners proud of having them. And maybe we can just skip the next slide and go directly to this one. Thank you. And a similar attitude to exotic artifacts was shared in the West too. And I'll comment only this last example. This, you see on the right, a Chinese vase that was probably offered to the Angevin king Louis of Hungary in the late 1330s. And in the West, the vase was transformed in a newer, adding silver gilt mounts that are only known to us from a drawing in the Guenière collection, which you see on the left. And again, the exotic object was enhanced by a mountain that underscored its otherness. So, if I try to sum up with a last slide, the reading of the literary sources shows that the contemplation of sumptuous objects was a source of pleasure for aristocrats around 1400, both West and East. This contemplation was an activity that took place in a familiar or even intimate setting, in small, close-knit groups of people who were closely linked to each other. In the field of precious objects, one of the most appreciated qualities, besides value and craftsmanship, was exoticism of materials, of techniques, of typologies. The luxury goods that were admired in this way participated fully not only in material and cultural life, but also in politics and diplomacy. This involvement of sumptuary products in international relations, if you will pardon this anachronistic term, was only possible, however, because the words that communicated through them recognized each other. It is only because the French knew or believed that others, Ottomans, Mongols, would react like them to objects that they could use these products in a useful way to establish a dialogue. If some behaviors were thus shared, the artifacts themselves drove their very aura from their strangeness. Thank you for your attention. Sorry, Flavia, I can't hear you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was telling that you gave us a wonderful and a very fruitful talk, and it's very interesting for us to see how these objects circulated from the west to the east, because the last exhibitions or the last bibliography that I've been in touch, they just research the other way around, so from the east to west. And I think it's very important what you said. Well, we have some questions here, and I'm trying to make some of them, to read some of them. There are lots of people thanking you for this wonderful speech, so generous and profound, with informations and knowledge, and that is an honor for us to receive you. And also that it's a privilege to hear you, and that you talk, stress the dynamic societies in relation, communication, and interaction. And also, well, the first question is, please, which kind of representative, a diplomatic representative of the images? No, he says that more than works, artworks, they were pieces with a great, with very important politician meaning, in that period. So he wanted you to talk a little bit more. And Paulo Christian says, Professor Michele, first of all, I would like to thank you for your presence and congratulate the clear and thought-provoking communication. Regarding the circulation of city textiles between East and West, we note an earlier movement that is closely associated with the territorialities linked to Byzantium and Fatimid Egypt that, it continues, for in turn, it manifests itself, for example, in England and France. With this, would it be possible to identify some kind of continuity from the exchanges seen in the 14th century, or is it necessary to identify ruptures, as in the case of the iconographic programs?
Okay, I'll try to answer both questions in order. Concerning, and I hope I rightly understood the questions. Concerning the political meaning of the gifts, I would like to clarify my ideas about a couple of points. First, it seems that these kind of gifts are used to smooth the negotiations. Most of the gifts don't have a political meaning in themselves. In this way, the Alexander tapestries are kind of an exception with this possible double-edged political meaning, flattering the Sultan or expressing the desire for revenge by the Duke of Burgundy. But the other gifts don't carry in themselves a political meaning. Their use is in bettering the relationships between the two partners. And for this reason, iconography seems less important than the material, the material value, and the rarity of the objects. The East and West princes of, or at least Western princes, offer desired objects that couldn't be obtained easily in the East, and this is what makes these objects valuable. This I don't mean to say that this was always the rule, because, for instance, reading other texts addressing the visit, for instance, of Emperor Charles IV of Bohemia to Charles V of France in 1378, a chronicle describes the gifts that were exchanged during the visit, and they clearly contained political messages in their iconography. I wrote something about this in an article I published a few years ago. So sometimes political iconography existed, but in most of my examples, the point was another. And about exchanges of textiles, of course, there is a long history of Westerners seeking precious Eastern textiles, notably from Byzantium or Islamic countries, and this is quite well known from, I mean, probably from the Romanesque period, at least, even earlier, and it still goes on in France around 1400, and all the texts I used in excerpts we didn't read it together show clearly that Eastern silks were still very much sought after at the French courts. But my point was to show that and this seems to me to be less known than the success of Eastern silks. What I wanted to show is that Eastern princes sought Western linen or woolen precious textiles as eagerly as Western princes tried to obtain Eastern silks. So this is the only reason why I mostly stressed gifts from the West to the East, because as you said, this has been less taken into account than the other way round. And it is also, I must admit, because for me it's more, I mean, I don't know Arabic well. I don't know Arabic at all, so it's easier for me to look at sources that describe what happened in the West. I hope I answered the questions.
Yes, thank you. And I have two more questions from a dear friend of mine. It's Professor René Lomes Gomes. He's a professor at Federal University in Minas Gerais, and he's an expert in ivories. Okay. African ivories, and he studies the circulation of ivories within the Atlantic, so from Africa to Brazil, and he discovered that we had some workshops, ivory workshops in Brazil in the colonial period, and our last conference will be his. So okay. He asks you two questions. First of all, given what was presented to us, I have two questions. Does Professor Tomasi know how long the Arras tapestries with the story of Alexander the Great were produced? I am working with inventories of the Seville nobility and noticed that the existence of a great old cloth, I quote, a great old cloth from Arras with the history of Alexander, end of quote, inventored in 1507 in the house of the third Duke of Medina Sidonian, Don Juan de Guzman, but which was probably inherited from his father. And then the second one is, this is something that I like it also very much. Besides the word strange, which terms appear in the document to name what is exotic. In these situations, does it seem to you to have a different meaning between exotic as something that comes from afar and exotic as something different or strange as we use it today?
Thank you very much for both questions. So I showed an example of an Arras tapestry with the story of Alexander the Great, dating from around 1460. So I guess that the father of the aristocrat who had the tapestry in the collection could have acquired a tapestry around that time. And anyway, as you certainly know, the how do you say, the large scale models for tapestry could be kept for a long time, either from the weavers or from the patrons, and so it would have been easy to weave another version of a tapestry even some decades later. And the person who has most studied tapestries with ancient histories in recent times is probably Monika Stucki Schürer. And if I can send some references if needed by email through Flavia. And concerning the use of étrange, of course, the first meaning of the word is just stranger, and so. But it seems to me that in some texts around 1400 that talk about artworks and looking at art, only in those texts it is used in this more precise meaning of exotic. Otherwise, we can find, for instance, this in the adjective étrange in inventories to describe precious stones, and especially precious stones that had unexpected color, with how do you say, stain, for instance. So in the inventories, actually, as your colleague suggests, the adjective seems more to describe something which is strange, weird, unusual, and maybe also stranger, because most of precious stones came from afar. And this meaning of exotic only appears in a smaller corpus of literary texts, the one I mentioned, and some other ones that I didn't have time to show you, but that date from the same period and were produced in the same cultural context at the courts of France.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we had all the. Well, now I'm going to make you a little question, and it's very interesting to think how these tapestries, for example, that from Alexander the Great, and sometimes showing the Trojans. I don't know if we have this inventory of tapestries going to the east from the west in the 15th and the 4th and 16th centuries. Do you have some notice of that? Because these tapestries from Ahaz that were trying to figure out the Battle of Troy, no?
Yeah.
Then there, the Trojans were disguised as Turks.
Yeah.
So how would people in the East receive this?
Yeah.
But we are talking in another time. I just think of
that's a very interesting question, and it's difficult to me to answer it because I don't know well the Eastern sources. The only example I have is a biography written by written in the mid 15th century by an Arabic writer, a biography of Tamerlane, and he actually describes a Western tapestry that Tamerlane displayed welcoming Spanish ambassadors in Samarkand in the early 15th century. But this description has a few problems because it's written many decades after the fact.
yes.
And we know that the author was in Samarkand at the time of the meeting, but he didn't plan to write a biography of Tamerlane at the time. So did he really took notes about the tapestry? This seems difficult. And anyway, he describes in some detail the hanging, but it seems to be something like that has no clear literary or historical iconography. He talks about plants and trees and birds and children. And so the first question we could ask is maybe if these the Eastern public could even at all recognize the subjects, because the subjects are always so densely represented, and everything is so conditioned by conventions that, not having those conventions, one could wonder if they even could decipher the images. This would be my first reaction, but I need to think more about this, and I will certainly do. Thank you.
But this is a very important issue you just said, no? We have two more things. I will read you two more things. One is from Karin Filipov, and Karin is a researcher here in Brazil, from the paintings of, oh my God, I forgot the name, Benedito Calixto. And she writes, Mr. Tomasi, your lecture was delightful. I really appreciated it a lot, especially when you talked about the secondary circulation provided by Philip the Bold. This allows us to think about the circulation of ideas. And last but not least, your great friend, Jean-Marie Guillouet, says, hello, Michele, congrats from Dijon. So, see, we are reaching
Thank you.
a foreign audience too. Thank you, Jean-Marie, for being with us. And you will be with us again in how you say in English? Thursday. So, lundi. Well, I actually have to thank you so much, Michele. We are at the ending of our time.
Thank
and
you.
I'd like to thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you for the first time.
My pleasure, my honor.
Oh, you are we say that when we know our bibliography, we touch heaven. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope to see you. Carolina writes, do you know any documentation that mentions Greek manuscripts written on parchment dyed purple in the context of exchanging gifts? Carolina, como a gente está terminando, eu vou pedir para ele responder para mim por e-mail e depois eu mando para você, tá bem?
But
Michele,
it will be quick because I'm sorry.
No.
But
Okay.
I keep an eye open for that.
Okay.
And if I come across anything, I'll tell you. I'll let you know.
Thank you very much, Michele.
Thank you.
Have a nice night. Thank you. Hope to see you again soon.
Bon travail pour la suite.
Merci. Ciao.
Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao.